The air in Manila is thick with the taste of cordite and powdered concrete. January 1942. Smoke drifts across the ruined courtyards of Sternberg General Hospital, lit from beneath by the stubborn orange glow of fires that refuse to die. American and Filipino wounded lie in crowded, humid corridors, the linoleum floors slick with more than just antiseptic. Outside, the distant crump of Japanese artillery grows steadily closer, a grim metronome marking the end of the siege. In this chaos, movement is calm, focused. Women in stained white dresses and aprons, their faces etched with exhaustion yet devoid of panic, move from cot to cot. They are not civilians. They are officers of the United States Army Nurse Corps. Their hands, skilled and steady, bind shrapnel wounds, adjust splints, and offer sips of water. They do not flinch from the severity of the injuries or from the origin of the next patient being carried in. For among the Allied wounded, another form now appears on a litter, his uniform a different shade of khaki, his language incomprehensible. A Japanese pilot shot down over the city. The nurses exchange a glance, a silent communication born of professionalism that transcends the fury of the battle outside. Without a word, they clear a space. The enemy is brought into their care. This simple, profound act, repeated across the collapsing front lines of the Pacific, would become a weapon for which the Japanese High Command was utterly unprepared. To understand the seismic shock of American mercy, one must first comprehend the ideological fortress the Japanese soldier was raised within. The Japan of the 1930s was a nation consumed by potent and dangerous spiritual nationalism. The Meiji Restoration had modernized the state, but a deliberate revival of ancient samurai code, Bushido, was engineered to serve the modern imperial war machine. This was not the nuanced philosophy of the Tokugawa-era scholars. It was a simplified, state-mandated creed. The warrior's path was one of absolute loyalty to the emperor, a divine figure, and utter contempt for death. Surrender was the ultimate dishonor, staining not just the soldier but his family and ancestors. A captured soldier was Nikyuden, human bullet, but one that had failed to strike its target. He was erased. To the Japanese military command, this belief was not abstract, it was a tactical calculus. A soldier who would die before being captured required fewer guards, consumed no resources, and revealed no secrets. This ethos was hammered into recruits through brutal training designed to break the individual and rebuild him as a component of the national body. Concurrently, a racial and ideological propaganda campaign portrayed the coming war as a holy crusade. The West, particularly America and Britain, was depicted as decadent, materialistic, soft, and racially inferior. This was the ABCD encirclement: American, British, Chinese, Dutch, a narrative of jealous powers strangling Japan's rightful destiny for resources and empire. Western individualism was scorned as weakness. Their concept of chivalry and the rules of war were seen as hypocritical constructs of a dying civilization. The American, in specific Japanese propaganda leaflets and training, was a monster, a brute who would torture and mutilate the captured. This dehumanization was a deliberate tool. If the enemy is not human, killing him is not murder. If the enemy is a demon, expecting mercy from him is foolish, and offering him mercy is treasonous. By December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were not just armed forces, they were spiritual instruments, believing their purity of spirit would triumph over Western steel and numbers. They were psychologically primed for a war of annihilation, expecting the same in return. On the other side of the ocean stood a very different institution. The United States Army Nurse Corps, established in 1901, was a professional body of women who were officers in status but often faced the rigid gender constraints of their time. They were trained not in the negation of the self, but in the rigorous science of preserving life. Their creed was the Geneva Conventions, their ethos rooted in the legacy of Florence Nightingale and the horrors of the First World War, which had cemented the principle of triage and neutral care for the wounded. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, these nurses, stationed in Hawaii, the Philippines, and aboard hospital ships, were thrust into the furnace of total war. They responded not as ideologues but as clinicians. In the burning chaos of Pearl Harbor, they operated on sailors regardless of their ship, their rank, or the color of their skin, using makeshift lighting and dwindling supplies. The opening months of the Pacific War were a relentless cascade of Japanese victories: Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Each conquest was marked by staggering brutality against captured Allied soldiers and civilians alike. The Bataan Death March in April 1942 became the starkest emblem of this new kind of warfare, a deliberate, systematic effort to exhaust, degrade, and kill prisoners through gratuitous violence and neglect. The Japanese High Command saw this as a logical extension of their philosophy. Prisoners were horyo, a term laden with contempt, and were entitled to nothing. Their very existence was an inconvenience and an insult to the Japanese warrior who had died in the same battle. Against this backdrop, the fate of the captured American nurses seemed preordained. They were women in a warrior culture that relegated females to a subordinate role, and they were officers of a despised enemy army. Their professional identity in Japanese eyes was a paradox that likely held no value. They were expected to be victims or, at best, useless cargo. The stage was set for a collision not just of armies, but of diametrically opposed conceptions of humanity, duty, and honor. This collision would find its arena not in the open ocean or the jungle clearing, but in the suffocating confines of prison camps, where the last vestiges of civilization were stripped away and core principles were laid bare. The American nurses captured in the Philippines, the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, endured the same horrific deprivations as the male prisoners: the starvation, the tropical diseases, the capricious brutality of their guards. They were moved from Santo Tomas internment camp to the isolated Los Baños camp, their existence reduced to a daily struggle for scraps of food and dignity. Yet within these camps they immediately re-established their purpose. Using scavenged materials, smuggled items, and sheer ingenuity, they created makeshift hospitals. They treated malaria with boiled papaya leaves, fashioned surgical tools from kitchen utensils, and used laundry soap for disinfectant. Their patients were their fellow Allied internees, civilians, soldiers, and children ravaged by dysentery, beriberi, and dengue fever. But the rules of their profession, ingrained deeper than any camp order, held no boundaries of nationality for the wounded. This fundamental tenet was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. As the Allied counteroffensive gathered momentum in 1944, the skies over the Philippines became a battleground once more. American aircraft pounded Japanese positions and dogfights swirled above the internment camps. It was inevitable that the tools of war would fall within the barbed wire. Japanese soldiers manning anti-aircraft guns on camp perimeter were vulnerable. During an air raid, a near miss from a strafing P-38 or shrapnel from a bomb could wound a guard just as easily as it could an internee. These wounded Japanese soldiers presented a profound dilemma. The camp commandants, operating on the very ideology that despised weakness, often saw their own wounded as failures, sometimes abandoning them or providing only the most cursory care. The sight of a suffering Japanese guard left untended by his own comrades became a silent accusation within the camp walls. For the American nurses, however, he was no longer a guard. He was a human being in physiological distress, a patient, and so they would motion to take him in. They were not naive idealists, they were hardened medical professionals. Women like Lieutenant Colonel Madeline Ullum, chief nurse at Sternberg General, who orchestrated the care for hundreds under bombardment, or Second Lieutenant Eunice Young, who survived the sinkings of hospital ships and continued nursing in captivity. They had joined the Army Nurse Corps for adventure, for patriotism, for career opportunity, reasons familiar to any young professional. The war forged them into something else. Their humanity was not a soft, sentimental impulse. It was a disciplined, active principle. In camp, their uniform was a worn dress, their insignia long gone, but their authority remained rooted in competence. When they chose to treat a wounded enemy, it was a conscious application of their oath. It required navigating the fury of fellow prisoners who saw only a brutal jailer, and the suspicion of Japanese guards who could interpret the act as espionage or insult. The act was a quiet rebellion, a reassertion of their identity in a place designed to erase it. They were proving to themselves and to their captors that their power to heal was a form of sovereignty no captor could take. In the resource-starved ecosystem of a prison camp, medicine was a critical strategic commodity. Every bandage, every drop of antiseptic, every calorie of special food for the critically ill was a finite asset fought over. To allocate any of this to the enemy was, on a purely pragmatic level, a direct subtraction from the survival chances of the nurses' fellow prisoners and themselves. This was not abstract mercy, it was tangible sacrifice. The nurses operated from a position of profound scarcity, not abundance. Furthermore, they understood the tactical landscape of the camp. Treating a guard could be a risk mitigation strategy, potentially fostering a sliver of goodwill or hesitation in a future moment of violence from that individual. But the historical record shows their actions were consistent, even when no benefit was possible. They were applying the brutal calculus of triage, the assessment of need alone, to a situation where every instinct screamed for partisan loyalty. In doing so, they were commandeering the moral high ground as a defensible position, turning the camp's infirmary into neutral territory under their control, a small Geneva Convention in a place that recognized none. The nurses' power was amplified by a simple technological truth: their skills were force multipliers for compassion. In an age before antibiotics were widely available, their most potent weapons were antiseptic technique, meticulous wound debridement, and physiological knowledge. A gangrenous wound on a guard's leg, left untreated by his own medics who may have lacked supplies or will, was a death sentence. The nurse's intervention, boiling instruments, cleaning the wound, applying a clean poultice, was often the difference between life and death. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a clinically effective one. Their knowledge scaled their humanity. They could not feed the entire camp, but they could save a specific life with specific actions. This visible, successful application of Western medical science on a Japanese body was a powerful, silent message. It demonstrated a mastery over suffering that transcended the crude mastery of violence. The enemy's propaganda said they were soft and decadent. Their stitches, their clean dressings, their reduction of a fever proved they possessed a potent, practical discipline the Japanese system in that moment had failed to provide for its own. For the average Japanese guard, the sight of American nurses tending to his wounded comrade was not just surprising, it was psychologically disruptive. His entire indoctrination presented a coherent world. The Japanese were spiritually superior, bound by Bushido. The Americans were selfish, weak, and barbaric. The cognitive dissonance created by this act of mercy was profound. Here was the barbarian performing a duty of profound humanity, a duty his own command structure often neglected. The guard was forced into a silent internal conflict. He could dismiss the act as a trick, a form of espionage, which some hardline Kempeitai officers likely did. Or on a more human level, he had to silently acknowledge the nurse's professional compassion, creating a crack in the monolithic image of the enemy. This was dangerous to the Japanese psychological warfare apparatus. Their propaganda relied on dehumanization to facilitate brutality and maintain unit cohesion. An act of unambiguous kindness forced a moment of rehumanization. It invited a question, however suppressed. If the enemy is capable of this, what does that make us? For some guards, it may have only resulted in a begrudging, confused tolerance of the nurses. For others, it planted a seed of doubt that unraveled the very fabric of the hateful ideology they were sworn to uphold. This moment represented a direct clash between two codes of conduct. The Japanese code of Bushido, as practiced in the Showa era, was exclusive and vertical. Loyalty and honor flowed upward to the emperor and inward to the unit. Compassion for a dishonorable enemy had no place, it was a weakness. The enemy, once defeated, existed outside the sphere of moral obligation. The American nurses, however, were operating under a different, more universal code, a fusion of the Hippocratic Oath, the Geneva Conventions, and a Western concept of chivalry that, however imperfectly applied in warfare, held the treatment of the wounded as a sacred duty transcending nationality. This code was horizontal. It applied to anyone in medical need. The nurse's actions exposed the fatal flaw in the wartime perversion of Bushido. It had no moral mechanism for dealing with a defeated enemy except through annihilation or subjugation. When faced with a wounded man, their code offered no guidance but neglect. The American code, by contrast, had a clear, actionable directive: heal. In the mud of Los Baños, this was not a philosophical debate. It was a living, breathing contradiction that placed the two systems side by side, revealing one as fundamentally sterile in the face of human suffering, and the other as capable of generating grace under the most degrading conditions imaginable. These converging angles, human, tactical, technological, psychological, and moral, set the stage for a climax that was not marked by the roar of guns, but by the silent, devastating power of a choice repeated in the shadows of a prison camp. The turning point was not a single event, but a series of quiet, relentless episodes that formed a pattern the Japanese command could not ignore. The setting was always the camp hospital, a shack with dirt floors, or a corner of a barracks claimed for medical use. The actors were the nurses, their supplies hidden or begged for, their energy sapped by malnutrition. The trigger was the sound of an air raid siren, or the aftermath of a guerrilla ambush near the camp perimeter, bringing in the broken human results of the war's violence. One documented instance at the Los Baños internment camp is emblematic. During a fierce Allied air raid, Japanese anti-aircraft gunners on the camp's edge were targeted by strafing fighters. A young gunner was hit, his leg shattered by .50 caliber fire. His comrades, under orders to maintain their posts or fleeing for their own cover, dragged him to the camp's gate and left him. He was, by the code they lived under, already a burden. The camp's Japanese medical officer, if present, was often ill-equipped or indifferent. The gunner lay bleeding, his cries ignored by his own army. It was then that the American nurse on duty, likely after a tense, hurried consultation with her chief, made a decision. She gathered what passed for her medical kit, perhaps a clean rag, a strip of cloth for a tourniquet, a precious splash of distilled alcohol. She walked under the gaze of both despairing prisoners and suspicious guards to the gate. She did not wait for permission. Her authority was that of a professional facing a medical emergency. The treatment was not a mere gesture. It was often extensive and life-saving. Nurses would clean gaping wounds, picking out dirt and shrapnel. They would set broken bones with fashion splints. They would fight infection with the last of their sulfa powder, a commodity more valuable than gold in the camp. They administered what pain relief they had, which was little more than reassurance. The patient was always a terrified young man, separated from his unit in excruciating pain and now completely at the mercy of the people he had been taught were monsters. The psychological transformation in that Japanese soldier was immediate and profound. His fear did not vanish, but it mutated into a shocked, bewildered dependency. The act of care created a bond, a human connection that bypassed all indoctrination. He would look at his clean dressing, feel the relief from the fever, and the entire architecture of the propaganda he had consumed would tremble. The true climax of this psychological campaign occurred not in the infirmary, but in the minds of the Japanese leadership and the wider prisoner population. News of these acts, whispered from guard to guard, prisoner to prisoner, became a potent subversive currency. The nurses' consistent behavior created an undeniable pattern. It was one thing for a single, perhaps misguided, individual to show weakness. It was another for an entire unit of enemy officers, women no less, to repeatedly and methodically apply a higher standard of conduct. The Kempeitai military police and camp commandants took note. They understood ideology and they recognized a direct challenge to theirs. In some camps, commandants confronted the nurses. They would demand to know why precious medical supplies were being used on the emperor's enemies. The nurses' reported responses were variations on a theme rooted in their professional identity. He is a wounded man. It is our duty. There was no political argument, no moral grandstanding, just a flat, factual statement of their code. This simplicity was unassailable. To punish them for it would be to openly punish the act of mercy itself, an admission that their own ideology could not tolerate such a basic human impulse. Some commandants, bewildered, allowed it to continue. Others tightened restrictions, but the acts persisted in secret. The very intractability of the nurses' position, their refusal to stop being nurses, even for the enemy, became their most powerful weapon. The climax was also internal, within the Allied camp. Initially, some starving, angry prisoners saw treating enemy wounded as a betrayal. "Let the bastard die," was a common, understandable sentiment. But over time, as the nurses stood firm, a shift occurred. The prisoners witnessed their captors' confusion and the nurses' unwavering integrity. This steadfast commitment to a universal principle became a source of immense moral strength for the entire imprisoned community. It was a defiant declaration that even in this hell, they would not become like their captors. The nurses, by healing the enemy, were paradoxically preserving the humanity of their own people. The moment of turning point, therefore, was cumulative. It was the point at which the Japanese command realized they could not stop this silent medical insurrection, and the prisoners realized it was a form of resistance they could all be proud of. The war for their souls in those moments was won not with a fist, but with a bandage. This relentless, quiet defiance set in motion a chain of consequences that would extend far beyond the barbed wire, into the halls of military intelligence and the shattered psyche of a defeated nation. The immediate physical aftermath was liberation. On February 23, 1945, U.S. Army Rangers and Filipino guerrillas staged a daring airborne and amphibious raid on Los Baños, freeing all 2,147 internees with miraculously light casualties. The nurses, emaciated but unbowed, were evacuated. Their survival rate, thanks in part to their own rigorous sanitation and medical care, was remarkably high. But their story did not end on the rescue boats. They returned to a United States that welcomed them as heroes. The angels were celebrated in newspapers and newsreels, yet the deeper, more strategic aftermath was only beginning to be understood by Allied intelligence. In the chaotic final months of the Pacific War, as U.S. forces advanced and captured Japanese soldiers in increasing numbers, intelligence officers and psychologists with the Office of War Information began interrogating prisoners. They were attempting to crack the infamous Japanese reluctance to surrender, seeking psychological vulnerabilities. Among the standard questions about unit strength and morale, a curious, unexpected thread emerged. Some prisoners, particularly those captured in the Philippines or who had served in garrison units, spoke not just of fear of American brutality but of stories they had heard. Stories from returned wounded soldiers or from guards transferred from internment camps. Stories about the American women in white who had healed Japanese wounded. These accounts were fragmentary, whispered, often expressed with profound confusion. For the interrogators, this was a point of immense value. It provided tangible evidence that the monstrous image of the American, central to Japanese defensive psychology, had a critical flaw. The propaganda could paint a picture of a demon, but it could not erase the first-hand, eyewitness testimony of a clean bandage applied by a gentle hand. The most profound aftermath unfolded in post-war Japan during the American occupation. General Douglas MacArthur's administration faced the Herculean task of demilitarizing and democratizing a population steeped in decades of militant nationalism. A key pillar of this effort was discrediting the old militarist regime and presenting America not as a vengeful conqueror, but as a just and humane victor. The story of the nurses, though not widely broadcast as official policy, seeped into this psychological landscape. When Japanese civilians and former soldiers witnessed the sheer scale of American humanitarian aid, the food drops, the medical assistance, the avoidance of reprisals, it created a cognitive dissonance that the old propaganda could not explain. For those who had heard the camp stories, however, this generosity was not a shock, it was a confirmation. The nurses' actions had provided a pre-existing template, a small-scale preview of the mercy the larger occupation would attempt to enact. It made the seemingly impossible transformation from bitter enemy to peaceful ally more psychologically plausible. For the nurses themselves, the aftermath was a lifetime of quiet reflection. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, their physical health permanently impacted by years of starvation and disease. They rarely spoke of treating the enemy wounded. In their minds, they had simply done their job. When pressed, their statements reflected a profound professional clarity. As one nurse, Lieutenant Bertha Charlie Dworsky Henderson, later reflected on such actions, "He was a human being, he was hurt." This simple ethos, lived under the most extreme duress, became their lasting testament. Their actions never made them rich or famous, but they created a legacy that quietly undermined one of the most potent psychological weapons of the 20th century, the complete dehumanization of the enemy. They proved that in the void where law and treaty had collapsed, individual conscience, armed with skill and courage, could still define what it meant to be civilized. The ripples of their quiet war extended from the interrogation huts of 1945 to the very foundation of the post-war order, challenging hatred at its root with an irrefutable demonstration of compassion. The story of the American nurses in Japanese prison camps transcends a mere anecdote of wartime kindness. It stands as a case study in the collision of two opposing systems of value at the precise point where humanity is most vulnerable: the broken body. The Japanese High Command had engineered a formidable psychological fortress, built on the pillars of racial superiority, spiritual purity, and the total negation of the enemy's humanity. They had prepared for every conceivable form of military resistance, but they had never drafted a contingency plan for unconditional mercy. They had no propaganda response to kindness. In the end, the nurses' power lay in their apolitical stance. They were not arguing for a different political system, they were demonstrating a different human condition. Their actions posed a question that brute force could not answer. What is true strength? Is it the power to inflict suffering or the will to alleviate it, even in your enemy? In the mud of Los Baños, the answer was written in clean linen and calm professionalism. This silent demonstration did not win a battle, but it won a more profound victory. It sowed irreversible doubt in the enemy's moral certainty and preserved the soul of the imprisoned. It proved that the most resilient weapon in war is not always the one that destroys, but sometimes the one that insists on creating order out of chaos, care out of cruelty, and a flicker of shared humanity in the heart of absolute hatred. Their legacy is a timeless reminder that in the darkest corners of history, the choice to see a human being rather than a uniform can be the most revolutionary act of all.